Welcome to the final video in this introductory series. It's a little longer than the other videos in this series because of the nature of the content. It's also taken a little longer to complete than the others for the same reason. It continues the themes introduced in the previous videos. In particular, it's critical of the simplistic and misguided approach characteristic of most business education and business practice. It also reinforces the view that the most crucial process in any organization is the process through which the dominating ideas arise and are changed. It goes some way to explaining this process and providing insights into how best to ensure that the process works for the benefit of the organization. It starts with a number of case studies which demonstrate why it is important to manage this process proactively rather than let it manage itself. As discussed earlier, it's important to know that conflict plays a central role in this process, which is something that will be demonstrated shortly through discussion of 3 case studies. It's therefore critical for the CEO of every organization to be able to deal with conflict effectively. Following a discussion of the case studies, I'll then provide an introduction to a superior framework for making sense of these case studies, with broader relevance for every organization. A framework that is superior to anything they teach at business school. But more on that shortly. The 3 cases being discussed are the result of substantial research. The first study was conducted by Raymond Miles and Charles Snow. Miles and Snow identified 4 organizational configurations: defenders, prospectors, analyzers, and reactors. Defenders are organizations that have narrow product market domains. Top managers in this type of organization are highly expert in their organization's limited area of operation. They do not tend to search outside of their domains for new opportunities. As a result of this narrow focus, these organizations seldom have to make major adjustments in their technology, structure, or method of operation. Instead, they focus their attention on improving the efficiency of their operations. Prospectors are organizations that almost continually search for new opportunities and regularly experiment with responses to emerging market trends. These organizations are often the creators of change and uncertainty to which their competitors must respond. However, because of the strong concern of these organizations for product innovation, they are not completely efficient. Analyzers are organizations that operate in 2 types of product market domains, one relatively stable, the other changing. In their stable areas, these organizations operate routinely and efficiently through use of formalized structures and processes. In their more turbulent areas, top managers watch their competitors closely for new ideas and rapidly adopt those that appear to be most promising. Reactors are organizations where top managers frequently perceive change and uncertainty occurring in their environments, but are unable to respond effectively. Because this type of organization lacks a consistent strategy-structure relationship, it seldom makes adjustments of any sort until forced to do so by external pressure. Miles and Snow characterize organizational success as an organization's ability to adapt to changes in its environment. And from their perspective, adaptability is demonstrated by how problems are solved. Specifically, they saw the adaptive process as solving entrepreneurial, engineering, and administrative problems. The entrepreneurial problem is about choosing the right product market domain. The engineering problem is about choosing the right technologies for production and distribution. The administrative problem involves 2 interrelated problems: selecting areas for future innovation and deciding how to rationalize the existing structure and process. Miles and Snow detail how problems were solved for 3 of these organizational types. They also demonstrate how the solutions involve consistent trade-offs with advantages and disadvantages. And they were very clear that these decisions were possible because of the way conflict was managed. For the defender organization, the entrepreneurial problem was how to seal off a portion of the total market to create a stable set of products and customers. The engineering problem was how to produce and distribute goods and services as efficiently as possible. And the administrative problem was how to maintain strict control of the organisation in order to ensure efficiency. For the prospector, the entrepreneurial problem was how to locate and exploit new product and market opportunities. The engineering problem was how to avoid long-term commitments to a single technological process. And the administrative problem was how to facilitate and coordinate numerous and diverse operations. For the analyzer organisation, the entrepreneurial problem was how to exploit new product market opportunities while maintaining existing product customers. The engineering problem was how to be efficient in the stable portions of their business and flexible in the changing portions. And the administrative problem was how to differentiate the organisation's structure and process to accommodate stable and dynamic areas of operation. In contrast to these successful organisational types were reactors. In their considered opinion, there were three reasons. Firstly, management failed to articulate a viable organisational strategy. Secondly, even if a strategy was articulated, the technology, structure and process were not linked to it in an appropriate manner. And thirdly, management adhered to a particular strategy structure relationship, even though it was no longer relevant to environmental conditions. You may recall Peter Drucker's requirement that for an organisation to be successful, there needs to be a valid theory of the business, from a previous video in the series. It's very clear that reactors didn't have a valid theory of the business. Now, as we'll see shortly, the underlying problem is ultimately an inability of executive management to deal effectively with conflict, something that will also be made obvious in our second case study. The second case study was conducted by Danny Miller and reported in his book and articles entitled Icarus Paradox. The subtitle of the book is How Exceptional Companies Bring About Their Own Downfall. Miller identified four trajectories in which the factors that drove the organisation's success actually became the cause of its ultimate decline. The focusing trajectory takes punctilious, quality-driven craftsmen, organisations with masterful engineers and airtight operations, and turns them into rigidly controlled, detail-obsessed tinkerers, firms whose insular, technocratic cultures alienate customers with perfect but irrelevant offerings. The venturing trajectory convert growth-driven builders, companies managed by imaginative leaders and creative planning and financial staffs, into impulsive, greedy imperialists who severely overtax their resources by expanding helter-skelter into businesses they know nothing about. The inventing trajectory takes pioneers with unexcelled R&D departments, flexible think tank operations and state-of-the-art products, and transforms them into utopian escapists run by cults of chaos-loving scientists who squander resources in pursuit of hopelessly grandiose and futuristic inventions. The decoupling trajectory transforms salesmen, organisations with unparalleled marketing skills, prominent brand names and broad markets, into aimless bureaucratic drifters whose sales fetish obscures design issues and who produce a stale and disjointed line of Me Too offerings. Miller analysed each of these trajectories along the three dimensions of strategy, culture and structure. He observed that craftsmen became tinkerers when a strategy of cost leadership becomes destructive parsimony, when quality leadership becomes irrelevant quality, when a focus on incremental innovation leads to stale product lines, and when selective marketing becomes weak marketing. In addition, he identified changes in the culture over time, whereby quality, engineering and product-driven cultures with cohesive clans became insular, monolithic and technocratic cultures with intimidating and controlling leadership. He also observed that from a structural perspective, craftsmen go from having tight controls and focused teams to bureaucratic and over-centralised tinkerers. He observed that builders become imperialists by moving from building a foundation through diversification to over-expansion and hyper-diversification. At the same time, their cultures move from being growth-oriented with entrepreneurial CEOs to cultures of chaos and gamemanship managed by egocentric CEOs. These organisations went from being divisionalised with influential finance and planning staff to being fragmented, overburdened and ritualistic. He also observed that pioneers went from routing out new niches reaming markets with technology, ramming innovation and focused marketing, to escapists where there was an explosion of new products, technology overkill, extravagant mega projects, and myopic marketing. These organisations also moved from having visionary CEOs and R&D cultures to having cultures of blind utopianism. The structure of these organisations also changed from being organic to being chaotic think tanks. He observed that salesmen went from strategies of image differentiation with full lines of products and services to drifters where image replaces substance and there's a proliferation of products. Builders' cultures went from being market share driven with competitive business units and professional administration to imperialist cultures where there was an excessive focus on numbers, leadership was remote, and there were warring units. In terms of structure, builders went from being decentralized to imperialists being bureaucratic and fragmented. Now, as we've discussed elsewhere, most management theory and practice assumes that organizations are rational, stable and uniform, and as such are at a loss when it comes to understanding the dynamics underpinning these trajectories or what needs to be done to correct them. These trajectories are clear examples of what happens when the most crucial process in the organization and the role of conflict are poorly understood and are left to take care of themselves, with catastrophic results. The third and most recent study was conducted by the Corporate Executive Board in the United States. The CEB conducted longitudinal research on the Fortune 100 companies in the United States and some international peers over the last 50 years. They found that 87%, or around 9 out of 10 of these companies, experienced a stall point where they stopped growing, stagnated, or went into decline. They also found that 76%, or around 3 out of every 4 of these companies, never regained their prior rate of growth after stalling. And that during the decade after experiencing a stall point, more than half of them never regained even moderate growth. And even 2 decades after their stall, less than 1 in 10 of those companies regained moderate growth, and almost 2 out of 3 of them vanished. In quantifying the damage done to these companies, they found that on average they lost 3/4 of their market capitalization. From these results, it should be clear that it's not a question of if, but when your business is going to experience a stall point. And the chances are that when it does, the consequences will be significant. The researchers identified and ranked a number of contextual, strategic and organisational factors as the causes of these stall points. Contextual factors accounted for 13%, organisational factors accounted for 17%, and strategic factors accounted for 70%. In other words, the researchers found that 87% of the causes behind these organisations stalling were within the direct control of the organisation's management. But what was even more surprising was how many of these companies never recovered from their stalls and how long their problems lasted. Unsurprisingly, they found that those in executive management during the period of stall lost their jobs as a result. But remember, these were all top 100 companies. They were all served by the most highly ranked management consulting firms available. So what happened? Why did they stall in the first place? And why didn't they just bounce back? Well, it's obvious that the executive management of these businesses didn't understand the problems they were facing, nor how to fix them. But it's also fair to say, if their advisors understood the problems and how to fix them, they failed spectacularly in helping their clients fix them. And at the end of the day, advisors can advise, but it's ultimately up to the executive management to follow or ignore that advice. But it's more than likely that they were just as lost as their clients and took them down lots of blind alleys that led nowhere. The CEB still distilled their findings down to a simple proposition that is consistent with the views expressed in a series of videos. In their view, it was executive management's inability to bring the underlying assumptions driving company strategy into line with external changes. By now that should have a familiar ring to it. Now each of these 3 separate studies demonstrates just how important it is for CEOs to understand the most crucial process in their organisation. And just in case you forgot what that process is, it's the process through which the dominating ideas arise and are changed and adapted to the prevailing situation. Now, as we've discussed, existing frameworks are less than helpful. What's required is a new theory for organisational management. We've already discussed how the schismatic metaphor captures the way organisations operate more accurately and the machine or organism as metaphors. You should also know that what you're about to learn is a departure from traditional management theory. You also need to know that it's only an introduction to the full framework. The full framework will be covered extensively in a separate series of videos, but this introduction provides the foundation upon which the rest of the framework is built. This framework revolves around a set of social dynamics that exist within every organisation, whether a formal business organisation or not. In fact, these dynamics actually determine how effective the formal dimensions of an organisation can be. It's also important to understand why I call this section an introduction. It is actually a more advanced theory than you've probably been exposed to before. It's based on the social theory of Pierre Bourdieu, a famous French sociologist who developed his theory through years of fieldwork studying different societies. This is particularly relevant for CEOs of larger, more established organisations. But any current or future CEO prepared to make the effort to understand it will benefit from the superior insights from the way organisations actually operate. I was first introduced to social theory of Pierre Bourdieu while completing my PhD in business. You may recall from an earlier video that in pursuing my PhD in business I became fascinated with the concept of dominant logic. Up until that time my study had revolved exclusively around contemporary management and organisational theory. I was trying to understand why successful organisations failed. And I came to the realisation that the answers I was looking for couldn't be found in existing management and organisational theory. In fact, it had become clear to me that most management organisational theory is based on flawed perspectives about the way organisations operate. Specifically, the assumptions about rationality, stability, and uniformity were an unrealistic foundation for understanding how organisations operate. Initially, I found the material I'm about to present to you quite foreign and uncomfortable, something I expect you'll probably experience as well. But the more I got into it, the more I found not only it challenged what I had been taught about the way organisations operate, it provided insight into the answers to many of the questions I'd accumulated over the years working and observing organisations. And I have no doubt that you will have a similar experience. It departs from the idea that the rational processes in our conscious awareness determine why we behave the way we do. It also reveals the causes of many organisational problems and much organisational dysfunction, as well as the reasons for success. It's consistent with the idea that much of our behaviour is a result of habits of thought and action that we are largely unaware of, that we've acquired through interaction with our world or our habitat. In short, it provides a more accurate frame through which to see and understand organisations. Bourdieu's theory is actually called a theory of action or practice. It revolves around three central interrelated concepts: habitus, field, and capital. Habitus can be thought of as a scheme of perception, thought, and action, a set of dispositions or a frame of reference. Habitus is formed over time through our interactions with the world. Habitus can also be thought of as habitual responses to things that happen to us. And everyone understands that we learn from our experiences, but few give much thought to the specifics of how or what we learn. Some people believe we inherit accumulated knowledge and learning of prior generations through memory passed on to us through our genes. This is consistent with the triune brain theory, one of the best approximations of the way our brain structures guide our behaviour. The most primitive part of our brain, the reptilian brain, refers to those brain structures related to territoriality, ritual behaviour, and other reptile behaviours. The limbic or mammalian brain refers to those brain structures associated with social and nurturing behaviours and mutual reciprocity. The neocortex represents those brain structures involved in advanced cognition, including planning, modelling, and stimulation. While many of us like to believe that our lives are governed by the rationality of our neocortex, the reality is that more primitive parts of our brain dominate it. The evidence also suggests that this is because much of our behaviour takes place without consciously being aware of it, and is therefore largely beyond our control. In fact, it's been estimated that up to 90% of our or more of our thoughts and behaviours are simply habit. We have pre-installed memories that increase our chances for survival through helping us anticipate and respond to different circumstances as they arise, but they can be out of place in current society. Now, whether you subscribe to the triune brain theory or not, it's generally accepted that we learn from our direct experience of the world. Now, it's important to realise that with any learning, earlier experiences frame the way we make sense of subsequent experiences. When we learn from experience, we will learn to make sense of the world and our part in it, and in doing so, our experiences help us to form our identity. In other words, our rationality is not just limited by our intellectual capacity, as Simon Herbert argued. It is also limited by our social conditioning, as Pierre Bourdieu argued. Irrespective of what happens to us, our experiences are mediated through our social environments, comprising family, friends, and acquaintances. And this mediation shapes the way we make sense of our experiences, and the process produces habitus. From our habitat comes our habitas. Unlike intentional learning, however, learning from experience occurs more randomly and unpredictably as different situations present themselves. And when it does, we do learn something, but we learn it through a frame that has been established in us from our prior experience. It's important to understand that as habitus is the product of social processes, it isn't something particular to an individual. Habitus is something that is shared by those who experience the same sort of social conditioning. As a result, not everyone has the same habitus. Different people have different habitus depending on the social environments they have been exposed to. Now, it's important to be clear that habitus is not so much acquired by us as much as it is embedded in us, a bit like our accumulation of scar tissue over the years. The social processes producing habitus occur in a social environment, social structure, or social class, Bourdieu called field. As will become clear shortly, a field consists of a set of historical relations between positions anchored in certain forms of power, capital. The analogy of a sporting field is as good as any in understanding what Bourdieu refers to as field. Each position performs a function and requires the person filling it to have certain skills and dispositions. This social structure, social class or field embeds itself in us in the form of habitus as a set of dispositions or a frame of reference. In other words, habitus, mental structure, represents the incorporation of the field, social structure, that created it. And in turn, habitus is always recreating the field or environment that gave rise to it, into which it is perfectly pre-adapted. Habitus is therefore the basis of action within the field. So habitus is always trying to create the field in which it is most suited and able to accurately anticipate what will happen. Importantly, a field only exists to the extent that players enter it, who believe in and actively pursue the prizes it offers. So each field operates on the basis of a game. And by now it should be clear that a field can apply to any social structure. For example, a field could potentially incorporate business in general, a product market domain, a specific business, a division, a department, or a work group. But it's also important to understand that people can participate in numerous fields at the same time. In a game, you have people competing and cooperating from the same prize. Competition in the game easily fits the situation of symmetrical schismogenesis discussed previously. Similarly, cooperation in the game fits the situation of complementary schismogenesis. It should therefore be apparent that schismatic metaphor provides for the possibility of stability as well as instability in organizations, as well as the possibility of uniformity or fragmentation. Now, it's important to understand that fields are not static. Fields are in constant change as a result of the struggles that take place between the social agents and groups within them. Agents and groups are always trying to reposition themselves and thereby shift the weight and relations of the basis of power, capital, within and between fields. Agents enter a particular field on the basis of their habitus and their capital. While capital is specific to each field, every field is a symbolic system, and every capital is translatable or convertible into symbolic capital. Importantly, when an agent enters a field, he does so on the basis that he will accept and submit to the rules of the game. And an agent will not be permitted to enter a field. It is believed that he or she will threaten the existing order of things. Each game operates under a different set of rules, some explicit, some implicit. Agents learn to navigate through the game under the constraints imposed by the rules, and the implicit rules are learned directly through experience of them. Each agent's habitus provides the basis for playing the game better or worse than other players. Habitus is therefore the basis for creativity and innovation in the game. An agent's success in the game reflects their ability to anticipate and respond effectively to the actions of other participants in the game. Each game therefore needs to be aware of the relative positions of the other participants in the game. But each agent's perspective of the game is limited because they only see the game from their position in it. This limitation is central to much of the organisational function that takes place, and is dealt with in much greater detail as part of the full framework. Each agent needs to be able to respond to different circumstances without the luxury of formulating an ideal response. Practice is the process of experiential learning, which is the best means of preparation for playing the game. When an agent is inseparable from his position in the game, the agent is unable to see the game for what it is. However, it's important to understand that there are actually two games being played, the immediate game and the hidden game. In the hidden game, the prize is the agent's influence over the rules of the game and the weights and conversion of capital into symbolic capital. The goal in the hidden game is the right to determine what is and what is not legitimate, and this game takes place in the field of power. Agents ultimately seek to maximize their interests and share of resources available within the field. In other words, agents struggle for dominance relative to other agents in the field. There is a continual process of selection between agents and fields based on their knowledge and their potential to achieve their objectives. The closer the natural affinity between an agent's habitus and field, the more likely an agent will be to enter a particular field. On entering a field, an agent will adopt a position consistent with his habitus and capital. An agent will improve his or her position within the field through the converging evolution of habitus and field and his accumulation of capital. An agent's position will worsen through divergence between their habitus and the field and through devaluation of their capital. As the agent continues to invest in developing his capital to play the game better and better, the agent's ability to play other games reduces. And an agent or group will ultimately be ejected from a field when the field can no longer accommodate their habitus. The field is considered to be autonomous to the extent that it can impose its specific logic or determinations external to it and mediate their effects on agents in it. The field's boundaries extend to the point that its effects cease. An agent's capital represents the skills, competencies, and attributes that have been developed through the influence of habitus in a particular field. An agent's capital provides the agent with the means to play the game within the field. The better an agent plays the game, the more capital the agent will accumulate. With the accumulation of more capital, an agent becomes more influential in the field. With more influence, the agent moves into a position to influence the valuation and conversion of capital within and between different fields. With more influence, the agent will increasingly influence the valuation and conversion of capital in the field and does so for the most benefit to them, so that their capital is the most valued and they have the most symbolic capital and therefore the most symbolic power. In the process, the agent's habitus will increasingly become dominant in the field. The influence held by a dominant agent or group within the field derives from their capital, but is bestowed on them by other agents in the field. Capital acts not only as a resource or source of power, but also as a legitimizing device for the exercise of power. Capital supports the interests of the dominating group, thereby perpetuating their domination. Those who dominate a field will establish the valuation and conversion of capital, which supports and perpetuates their domination. Within every field there is a hierarchy of dominance. Even within a dominant group within a field, there are some agents that are more dominant than others. In Bourdieu's words, agents are complicit in their own domination. Bourdieu describes the complicity of agents as the exercise of symbolic power, which is derived from the conversion of the agent's capital into symbolic capital. Even within the dominant group there is conflict as agents try to improve their position relative to others. And the conflict that takes place derives from the agent's competing habitus and competing capital. An agent's actions either support the perpetuation of the social order or are directed at changing it. Essentially, the social order changes through their influence on the valuation and distribution of capital. An agent holds the position in the field consistent with their habitus and their capital. Agents attempting to protect their position are interested in perpetuating the existing distribution and valuation of capital. Agents attempting to improve their position are interested in accumulating more capital and are increasingly able to do so. These agents may ultimately seek the power to decree the hierarchy and conversion rates between all forms of authority in the field of power. However, by having the power to determine which forms of capital have most value, they can maximize the value of their capital to be the most influential and dominant in the field. In contrast, agents whose positions are worsening relative to others are interested in perpetuating the value of their capital. Therefore, an agent's position and trajectory in the field will determine whether they are interested in preserving or subverting the existing distribution of capital. There are three species of capital: cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital, which are valued differently in each field, as well as symbolic capital. Symbolic capital is the form of capital that the other three forms of capital are convertible into. Cultural capital refers to cultural acquisitions such as knowledge and skills and the educational or technical qualifications associated with them. Economic capital refers to material wealth in its various forms, such as money and investments. Social capital refers to the value accruing to individuals and groups by virtue of possessing a durable network of associations. Symbolic capital can be thought of as prestige, reputation, or fame, which is the form assumed by other types of capital when recognized as legitimate. Symbolic capital is a kind of credit or advance that only the group's belief can grant to those who give it the best symbolic and material guarantees. The exhibition of symbolic capital attracts other capital to it. The processes involved in accumulating symbolic capital make no sense from an economic perspective and are misrecognized as being arbitrary. When viewed from a symbolic perspective in the context in which they are performed, they make practical sense. Therefore, the social space, for example, an organization, presents itself as a symbolic system of symbolic struggles. The conflicts that transpire occur on a symbolic level between dominant and dominated individuals and groups. The conflict is directed towards control over the resources within the field and ultimately over the right to determine what is legitimate, which ultimately reflects the rates of conversion of capital. In other words, the conflict involved is a struggle to impose vision and division. Not only is symbolic capital the capital into which all forms of capital are translatable, but it is also the basis for symbolic power. Symbolic power can only be exercised with the complicity of those who subject themselves to it. Paradoxically, those who are subjected to it do not want to know they are subject to it, or that they themselves exercise it. The social order is defined in and through the relations between those who exercise power and those who submit to it. As we have discussed, the relationship between habitus and field is critically important to understand. When there is a complete match between habitus and field, the result is something called doxa. Doxa can be traced back to Aristotle's endoxa, which describes opinions that are adequate enough, that rely on general or representative consensus. In other words, doxa is the socially produced, unquestioning acceptance of the world as it is, and the age and place in it. In contrast, if there is too much difference between the social conditions that gave rise to habitus and the prevailing conditions, hysteresis is the effect. Hysteresis is the term normally used to describe the physical phenomena of magnetic effects lagging behind their causes. In other words, the incompatibility of habitus, when presented with a foreign field, presents itself as a crisis in which the actions generated by habitus are ineffective. Hence, the reason why an agent whose habitus doesn't fit the field will ultimately be ejected from it. The exercise of symbolic power acts to perpetuate a particular social order, but can also be used to change a social order. Periods of crisis provide the best opportunity for exposing doctrine for what it is, myth confused for truth. Through heretical discourse, a break with the ordinary order is proclaimed and a new common sense is provided, which makes sense of the past. In the emergence of a new social order, a leader is given the right of creation of the group, the right to name the group, and the right to speak on behalf of the group. It is an iterative process through which the leader reconfigures and articulates the experience and significance of past events for the group in such a way as to give meaning and identity to the group. It is a situation in which one set of legitimized beliefs are replaced by another set of legitimized beliefs. And the basis of legitimization is an iterative and dialectic process emerging from the formation of a group and its leadership, in which the significance of events in history is recreated to make sense of the past and present with implications for the future. This framework reveals an organization as a symbolic system of symbolic struggles. Conflict can take place between different formal groups within the organization, between different informal groups, or between formal and informal groups. Each group will be thought of as a subfield, and each group will have their own hierarchy. Therefore, you can have a senior exec within a formal hierarchy, having little or no practical influence over people in a specific business subunit. When we look at the Miles Snow study through this framework, it becomes apparent that reactor organizations are ruled by symbolic conflict. When there is no dominant perspective within the organization of what the strategy should be, it is impossible to establish a viable strategy for the organization. And if there is no dominant perspective within the organization, even if the strategy is articulated, it will not be implemented consistently. In this regard, it is important to understand that for one group to be dominant, others must be submissive to it. If there is no dominant perspective, there is either too much or too little conflict taking place in the organization. Too much conflict results in no group being able to create momentum in one direction or another. Too little conflict arises in a situation where conflict is avoided, which usually occurs when there has been too much conflict and it hasn't been constructive conflict. The best description of conflict avoidance and its consequences is well documented elsewhere in the Abilene paradox. In contrast, if there is a dominant perspective, in challenging times the dominant group will resist having the value of their experience devalued. They will therefore perpetuate ideas and practices that reinforce the value of their knowledge and experience, even though they may be ineffective. They also tend to search the environment for confirmation that things are working in ways that validate those ideas and practices. In this environment, myths are perpetuated until the organisation enters a crisis, when their validity and the dominance of those perpetuating them are challenged. The challenge comes from heretics prepared to question the myths, make sense of them for others, and point the way to a better future without them. When we look at the trajectories documented by Danny Miller through this framework, we see the unbalanced process through which dominant attributes are perpetuated. To be successful, as we've seen, you need to have a dominant perspective. But we've also seen that to be unsuccessful, you can either have a dominant perspective or the absence of a dominant perspective. The trajectories documented by Danny Miller demonstrate how the dominant group emphasises certain attributes over time, those which the dominant group possess and to which the organisation's success is attributed. This tends to reinforce the considered importance and value of those attributes and those who possess them. Over time, people with those attributes are attracted to the organisation and are appointed into different areas to extend the scope of those attributes. The attributes become even more associated with success and the means to career progression. More and more people develop the attributes or are recruited with them. This happens to the point where anyone who questions the value of those attributes is not considered to have the right attributes for inclusion in decisions. Voices of dissent disappear, and those elevating their attributes increasingly have free rein with little to no resistance. At some point, the effect of spreading those valued attributes turns negative for the organisation. However, as we've seen from the early discussion, those who rose to senior positions due possession of those valued attributes seek to perpetuate their value until a crisis occurs and questions are asked about their value to the organisation. When we look at the CEB study through this framework, we see what happens when the most crucial process in an organisation isn't understood. And far from being an isolated instance, it's obvious that this problem is prevalent in business organisations. There certainly were dominant perspectives within each of the successful businesses that experienced a store point. The CEB determined that just 13% of the specific causes of store points in their study of the top 100 companies were outside the direct control of senior management. However, that doesn't mean that those 13% were beyond the anticipation of senior management. Yet senior management doesn't seem to have been aware of the problems until it was too late. Something was filtering out the fact that things weren't working the way they should. It's likely that there were plenty of warning signs, but they weren't recognised. To truly understand the process by which this happens, the full framework goes into the social dynamics between groups of differential power. But for present purposes, it's enough to understand that the filtering process starts in the executive team and cascades down the organisation. In any case, they didn't recognise they had problems, which by itself was enough to result in senior management of these organisations being fired. But once they became aware of it's what they did and didn't do that made the situation much worse for much longer than it should have been. What they did was to do what they had always done in the past to fix their problems. But what they did in the past no longer worked. These are clearer practical examples of the hysteresis effect. Now organisations, or more specifically executive teams, suffering from the hysteresis effect, normally turn to their trusted advisors for help. However, decades after their stalls, long after those executive management had departed, many of these organisations' problems continued. How do you explain that? The preferred approach to problems of continued non-performance is to change management. But it's likely that management had changed numerous times during the decades after these organisations stalled. So what happened? Well, the problems were deeply embedded in the organisation and the dominant ideas, practices, interactions and assumptions perpetuated by those remaining. Just because one set of executives leaves doesn't mean that the dominant perspective will necessarily shift. We've already established that an organisation needs a dominant perspective to be successful. But what happens when an organisation contains many businesses, as is the case of top 100 companies? The reality is that each business needs to have a dominant perspective. However, those at the top of the organisation often seek to impose their perspectives on how the business should be managed and often end up destroying a lot of value, particularly if their experience and knowledge about business has been acquired in a business materially different from the one in question. This is something that executive management of multi-business organisations need to guard against. The full framework goes into this in a lot more detail, but for present purposes it is important to realise that these social dynamics need to be carefully managed, and invariably the responsibility for doing so rests ultimately with the CEO. The right balance needs to be achieved, and the best way to do so comes from understanding how dominant ideas arise in an organisation and how change the prevailing situation. But to be honest, there aren't many places where you can get to learn this stuff, which is why I created CEO Online Academy. It's for current and future CEOs who just want to know what they need to know to be more successful, who recognise that they have some blockages or gaps in their knowledge, skills or attitude that they need to fix, who don't have the time, money or interest to fit into an academic program or learn irrelevant or bad theory, who would prefer to learn in private wherever and whenever it makes sense for them, who aren't interested in pointing to certificates on their CVs to impress their peers, their superiors or executive recruiters, but are more interested in being able to practically improve the results they get. Now, if that sounds like you, listen to what I'm about to say. The idea is that you can get access to the knowledge and insights you need to be more successful. You don't have to complete the same study program as me to get the knowledge and insights you need. You don't have to distill, organise or package the information because it's already done for you. You don't have to pay my consulting or coaching fees, which incidentally are at the higher end of the scale. In fact, you don't even have to talk to me if you don't want to. What you do need to do is go to CEO Online Academy and sign up for a trial membership. Then take a look around, find out what you don't know, and get a feel for what would make sense to sign up as a premium member. Now, if you're looking for something in particular and you can't find it, let me know. If it makes sense, I'll add it to the site. But I'd like to hear your feedback in any case because I want the information to be useful and valuable. I'll be updating the site on an ongoing basis with lots of useful information. Things like interviews, case studies, and from time to time webinars depending on members' interests. So if that sounds like something you'd like to be part of, sign up for a free trial today. However, if you're looking for some immediate assistance, you can contact me directly. I work exclusively as a consultant and CEO to current and future CEOs serious about delivering the best results they can